Pharaoh Ramesses II and his daughters. Ramesses II ruled Egypt for 66 years, fathered over 100 children, and built monuments so enormous they still dominate the Nile landscape 3,000 years later. He also married at least two of his own biological daughters, elevated them to the rank of great royal wife, and had those marriages inscribed on temple walls for eternity. The daughters in question were Bintanath and Meritaten, though some Egyptologists note the Meritaten connection requires further untangling from the Amarna period figure of the same name. What is clearly documented at Abu Simbel and elsewhere is that Bintanath bore Ramesses a child, meaning he was simultaneously that child's father and grandfather. What makes this particularly striking is that none of it was hidden. There was no scandal, no hushed palace rumor. It was state policy, carved in stone, presented as evidence of divine favor. The reasoning was theological as much as political. Pharaohs were not considered ordinary humans. They were living gods, direct manifestations of Horus on earth. And in Egyptian mythology, the gods themselves practiced exactly this kind of union. Osiris married his sister Isis. The divine bloodline was understood to be a separate category of existence from the human one, and mixing it with lesser blood was seen as dilution rather than preservation. Keeping power and divine essence concentrated within the smallest possible circle was framed not as transgression, but as sacred responsibility. Across the ancient world simultaneously, in Greece, in Mesopotamia, in the early Hebrew kingdoms, these same acts were treated as among the most serious violations imaginable. Egypt looked at the same behavior and put it on a temple. That contrast alone tells you something significant about how completely royal power can reshape the definition of normal. Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VIII. By the time the Ptolemaic dynasty was done with Egypt, the original pharaonic tradition of dynastic marriage looked almost restrained by comparison. The Ptolemies were Greeks who had ruled Egypt since Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC, and they took the concept of keeping power within the family to extremes that would have unsettled even Ramesses. Cleopatra II married her brother Ptolemy VI first, which was standard Ptolemaic practice. When Ptolemy VI died, she then married her other brother, Ptolemy VIII, a man Roman sources nicknamed Physcon, meaning potbelly, which gives you some sense of how history remembers him. Ptolemy VIII was already in a complicated political entanglement with Cleopatra II's own daughter, Cleopatra III, whom he also eventually married, meaning he was simultaneously the husband of a mother and her daughter. The domestic situation was, to put it mildly, unstable. The conflict between Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra II eventually escalated into open civil war, with Cleopatra II driving him out of Alexandria entirely and ruling Egypt alone for a period. His response, when he regained power, was one of the most calculated acts of personal cruelty in ancient history. According to the historian Diodorus Siculus, whose account historians note may carry some hostile bias, but is considered broadly credible, Ptolemy VIII had his own son by Cleopatra II, a boy named Memphis, murdered and dismembered. He then had the pieces packaged and delivered to Cleopatra II as a birthday gift. She was meant to open it during her celebrations. Despite this, and despite everything that preceded and followed it, the three of them, Ptolemy VIII, Cleopatra II, and Cleopatra III, eventually reached a political settlement and were listed jointly on official Egyptian documents as co-rulers. History records them sharing a throne. It does not record how any of them felt about sharing a dinner table. Emperor Claudius and Agrippina the Younger. The Roman Empire produced a remarkable number of catastrophic marriages, but the union of Emperor Claudius and his niece Agrippina the Younger in 49 AD stands apart because of how precisely deliberate it was and how spectacularly it backfired. Agrippina was the daughter of Germanicus, making her Claudius's own niece, a degree of relation that Roman law explicitly prohibited as the basis for marriage. Claudius solved this problem the way emperors solve inconvenient problems. He changed the law. A formal senatorial decree was passed, making uncle-niece marriage legal in Rome, specifically and transparently to facilitate this one union. Tacitus, writing in the Annals, describes the public reaction as somewhere between discomfort and open disgust, noting that this particular configuration was seen as quasi-incestuous even by Roman standards, which is a significant bar to clear. Agrippina's motivations were entirely transparent to everyone, including presumably Claudius. She was the most politically capable woman in Rome, had a son from a previous marriage named Nero, and wanted him on the imperial throne. Claudius already had a son, Britannicus, who was the natural heir. Marrying Claudius gave Agrippina the leverage to have Nero formally adopted and moved ahead in the succession. Then, In October of 54 AD, Claudius died after eating mushrooms at dinner. Ancient sources, including Tacitus and Suetonius, state plainly that Agrippina poisoned him, likely using a species of amanita prepared by a woman named Locusta, who was essentially a professional poisoner maintained by the imperial court. Historians debate the certainty of this, and it is possible Claudius simply died of illness. But the timing and the outcome aligned so perfectly with Agrippina's interests that ancient and modern observers alike have found coincidence difficult to accept. The result of the marriage was the reign of Nero, who eventually had Agrippina herself executed in 59 AD, completing one of history's more complete cycles of dynastic destruction. Isabella of Valois and Richard II of England. Richard II of England was 29 years old and needed a peace treaty with France. The French king had a daughter named Isabella, who was, at the time of their marriage in November 1396, 6 years old. The wedding took place at Calais, a piece of English-controlled French territory that served as neutral ground, and it was conducted with full royal ceremony, elaborate ritual, and the complete diplomatic gravity appropriate to a treaty between two major European powers. Isabella of Valois, born on the 9th of November 1389, became Queen of England, while she was still at an age when most children are learning to write. By most historical accounts, Richard treated her with genuine kindness and did not attempt to consummate the marriage, instead raising her more as a ward within the royal household while they waited for her to come of age. This is sometimes presented as evidence that the arrangement was not as troubling as it appears, but that framing requires accepting a fairly low baseline. The marriage was not about Isabella's well-being. It was a diplomatic instrument, and she was the instrument. When Richard was deposed in 1399 and died in captivity in early 1400, most likely starved to death at Pontefract Castle, Isabella was 10 years old and already a widow. She was returned to France having spent 4 years as an English queen. The French then arranged her second marriage to Charles, Duke of Orléans, when she was 17. She died in childbirth at 19. Her entire life, from the age of 6 onward, was defined by her value as a political object, passed between crowns like a letter of credit. Her own preferences at no point a recorded consideration. Mary of Burgundy and Maximilian I. On the 5th of January, 1477, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, died in battle at Nancy, leaving his 20-year-old daughter Mary as the heir to one of the wealthiest territories in Europe. Within days, the political vultures arrived. Louis XI of France immediately invaded Burgundian lands, hoping to absorb the territory and force a French marriage on Mary before she could arrange her own. The Holy Roman Emperor moved. The Spanish crown made inquiries. Every major European power understood instantly that whoever married Mary of Burgundy would inherit enormous wealth, strategic territory, and a claim over the Low Countries. Mary herself understood this too, but her ability to act was constrained by something more immediate than foreign armies. The city of Ghent, where she was effectively residing, held her in a state of political captivity. The Flemish cities demanded sweeping concessions of their own rights before they would support any marriage arrangement, and to demonstrate how serious they were, they arrested 2 of Mary's most trusted advisors. Hugo van der Goes's patrons, Pierre Hugonet and Guy de Brumeux, tried them on charges that most historians consider pretextual and executed them publicly in front of her. She had to watch. She then signed the document they wanted. Mary chose Maximilian of Habsburg, a match that would reshape European history, and they married in August 1477. By most accounts, the marriage was a genuine partnership, unusual for the era, but Mary died in March 1482 at 25, thrown from her horse during a hunting accident, leaving Maximilian as regent over territories and children that were not originally his and a Habsburg dynasty, positioned to dominate Europe for the next 2 centuries. The marriage that built an empire lasted less than 5 years and began with a woman watching her advisors executed while armies closed in on her borders. Juana of Castile and Philip the Handsome. Philip of Habsburg was called the Handsome, and, by contemporary accounts, the name was earned. He was charming, politically capable, and comprehensively unfaithful, conducting affairs throughout his marriage with a casualness that was not unusual for European royalty of the period, but that had a particular and devastating effect on his wife. Juana of Castile was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, heiress to the most powerful throne in Europe, and she was, by every account, from people who knew her, deeply and desperately in love with Philip in a way that went far beyond what the political calculus of their marriage required. When Philip died suddenly, on the 25th of September, 1506, at the age of 28, possibly from typhoid fever, though poison has never been entirely ruled out by historians, Juana's grief became the mechanism of her destruction. Contemporary and later accounts describe her refusing to allow his coffin to be sealed, traveling with it across Castile, and on at least some occasions opening it. The precise details of this period are contested, and some historians argue the most lurid accounts were exaggerated or invented by those who had political reasons to paint her as mad. What is not contested is what followed. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, declared her unfit to rule on the grounds of mental instability. When Ferdinand died and her son Charles inherited, Charles confirmed the arrangement. Juana spent the last 46 years of her life imprisoned at the castle of Tordesillas, classified as incapable of governing, while remaining the nominal Queen of Castile throughout. She died in 1555 at approximately 75 years old. Whether she was genuinely mentally ill or whether grief and inconvenience were weaponized to remove a woman from power she was legally entitled to hold is a question historians are still actively debating. The marriage that produced the most powerful ruler in Europe also produced one of its longest and most quietly horrifying political imprisonments. Henry VIII and Catherine Howard. Henry VIII's fifth marriage is the one that sits most uncomfortably, even by Tudor standards, which is a remarkably high bar. Catherine Howard was somewhere between 16 and 19 years old when she married the 49-year-old king in July 1540. Though her exact birth year is genuinely unknown, with estimates ranging from approximately 1523 to 1527. Henry, by this point, was a man in serious physical decline. His jousting injury had become a chronically infected leg wound that contemporaries described as producing a severe smell. His weight had expanded dramatically, his waist reportedly reaching extraordinary dimensions by his final years. Catherine's own history before the marriage was one of exploitation rather than romance. From around the age of 13, she had been in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where supervision was minimal and older men had access. Her music teacher, Henry Manox, began a sexual relationship with her when she was approximately that age. A man named Francis Derham followed. Both relationships happened to a girl who had no meaningful ability to refuse adults in positions of authority over her. When she became queen, Thomas Culpeper, a court favorite and a man with a documented history of violence against women, became involved with her. The exact nature of that involvement remains debated, but the outcome was not. Culpeper and Derham were both executed. Catherine was beheaded on the Tower of London on the 13th of February, 1542, almost certainly still a teenager. The night before her execution, she reportedly asked for the execution block to be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head correctly. This detail, which appears in later accounts, and should be treated with some caution as to its precise accuracy, has endured because it captures something true about her situation, regardless of its literal veracity. A girl, practicing for her own death, in a tower, trying to get it right. Mary Queen of Scots and Lord Bothwell. By 1567, Mary Queen of Scots had already lived enough for several lifetimes. Her first husband, the King of France, had died young. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, was a vain and politically useless man whom she had grown to despise, and who had participated in the murder of her secretary David Rizzio in front of her while she was pregnant. Then, on the night of the 10th of February 1567, the house where Darnley was staying in Edinburgh, a place called Kirk O'Field, was destroyed by an explosion. Darnley's body was found in the garden. He had not died in the blast. The evidence strongly suggests he was strangled before the explosion was set, which means the explosion was staged to conceal a murder. James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, was immediately and widely suspected. He was powerful, ambitious, and had the means and the motive. In April 1567, Bothwell abducted Mary while she was traveling, taking her to Dunbar Castle. What happened there is described differently depending on the source, but Mary's subsequent actions, specifically her agreement to marry Bothwell, were interpreted by most of her contemporaries and by many historians since as the result of coercion. Some historians argue she may have been complicit in Darnley's murder, and that the abduction was partly theater. The truth is genuinely uncertain. What is certain is the outcome. They married on the 15th of May, 1567. The Scottish nobility revolted almost immediately. Mary was captured, imprisoned at Lochleven Castle, and forced to abdicate. She miscarried twins during her imprisonment. Bothwell fled to Scandinavia, was captured by the Danes, and spent the remaining decade of his life chained in Dragsholm Castle, reportedly descending into madness. Mary escaped, fled to England, hoping for Elizabeth I's protection, and spent the next 18 years imprisoned before being executed on the 8th of February, 1587. The marriage lasted 3 months and destroyed both of them completely. The Habsburg inbreeding peak. The House of Habsburg did not have a family tree. They had a family circle, and they walked around it for 200 years. The deliberate policy of marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, and dynastically recycling the same bloodlines across generations was understood at the time as a method of keeping power consolidated and bloodlines pure. What it actually produced was one of the most well-documented cases of the biological consequences of inbreeding in recorded history. A study published in 2019 by researchers including Alvarez and colleagues analyzed the genealogical records of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty and calculated that by the time of Charles II of Spain, the last Spanish Habsburg king, his inbreeding coefficient had reached approximately 0.254. To understand what that number means, the coefficient for a child born to two full siblings would be 0.25. Charles II was more inbred than that. The results were visible and devastating. Charles II suffered from what contemporaries and modern medical historians identify as a collection of conditions consistent with severe inbreeding. The pronounced mandibular prognathism, known as the Habsburg jaw, was so extreme in his case that his upper and lower teeth could not meet, making chewing nearly impossible. He was reportedly unable to speak clearly due to the size of his tongue. He suffered from epilepsy, was impotent, and was described by contemporaries as physically and mentally fragile throughout his short life of 38 years. He died in 1700 without an heir, ending the Spanish Habsburg line entirely and triggering the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped Europe. The dynasty's obsession with blood purity had, across 2 centuries of deliberate marriages, systematically dismantled the very bloodline it was trying to protect. Philip II had married his own niece, Anna of Austria, in 1570. Their descendants kept compressing the circle. Each generation made the same calculation. Each generation handed a slightly worse set of consequences to the next. Charles II was the final invoice. Napoleon Bonaparte and Marie-Louise of Austria. Napoleon Bonaparte divorced Joséphine de Beauharnais on the 15th of December, 1809, in a formal ceremony at which both of them reportedly wept. He was 40 years old, and at the height of his power. She was 46 and could not give him a child. The divorce was strategic, and it was devastating, and Napoleon appears to have experienced it as both simultaneously. He then set about selecting a new wife with the same methodical efficiency he applied to military campaigns. He considered a Russian princess. He considered various other candidates. He settled on Marie-Louise of Austria, the 18-year-old daughter of Emperor Francis I, the man whose armies Napoleon had defeated at Austerlitz and Wagram, whose empire Napoleon had humiliated, whose capital Vienna Napoleon had occupied twice. Marie-Louise had been raised in the Austrian imperial court to understand Napoleon as a monster, a Corsican tyrant, the destroyer of European civilization. According to accounts of her pre-marriage preparation, she had to be specifically reassured that he was not physically deformed before she could bring herself to accept the match. She had no meaningful alternative. The marriage took place on the 2nd of April 1810. Marie-Louise bore Napoleon a son, Napoleon II, on March 20, 1811, securing the heir he had divorced Josephine to obtain. By most accounts, she adjusted to the marriage more successfully than anyone had expected, reportedly developing genuine affection for Napoleon. Then the empire collapsed. When Napoleon was exiled to Elba in 1814, Marie-Louise did not follow him. She returned to Austria, was given the Duchy of Parma to govern, and eventually took a new partner and a second marriage. Napoleon spent his final years on St. Helena. Their son, given the title King of Rome and later Duke of Reichstadt, died in Vienna in 1832 at the age of 21, having never ruled anything. The heir for whom an empress was divorced and an empire arranged a dynastic marriage never sat on a throne. King Leopold II of Belgium and Marie Henriette of Austria. Leopold II and Marie Henriette of Austria married on the 22nd of August 1853, and by most historical accounts, they were spectacularly mismatched from the first day. She was energetic, warm, fond of horses, and possessed of a straightforward personality that fit poorly with the cold, calculating, secretive man she had been assigned to. Leopold was already, even as a young man, obsessed with the acquisition of a colonial territory he could control personally, independent of the Belgian parliament that constrained his domestic power. Marie Henriette reportedly described her marriage as a prison. She eventually relocated to the spa town of Spa in Belgium and lived separately from Leopold for a significant portion of their marriage, a separation that became effectively permanent. Leopold poured his energy into the Congo through a campaign of deliberate international deception conducted at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. He persuaded European powers and the United States that his proposed Congo Free State would be a humanitarian project, a free trade zone that would bring civilization to Central Africa. What he built instead was a slave state operated for the extraction of rubber and ivory, enforced through systematic mutilation and murder. Estimates of the death toll vary significantly among historians, with figures ranging from 1 million to 10 million Congolese people killed through direct violence, starvation, and disease during Leopold's personal rule from 1885 to 1908. Marie Henriette died in 1902, still technically his wife, having spent decades in effective separation from a man whose private activities constituted one of the worst atrocities of the 19th century. Leopold spent his final years with a young mistress, Blanche Delacroix, whom he met when she was reportedly around 16 years old and he was in his 60s. He died in 1909, having surrendered the Congo to the Belgian state the previous year under international pressure and reportedly having burned the administrative archives to prevent documentation of what had been done there. Emperor Hirohito and the imperial marriage system. Hirohito's marriage to Nagako Kuni in January 1924 began with a government committee debating her genetics. A faction within the imperial court had discovered, or claimed to have discovered, that Nagako carried a gene associated with color blindness, and on this basis, they moved to block the engagement and substitute a different bride. The objection had nothing to do with Nagako's character, her intelligence, or her preparation for the role of empress. It was a biological audit conducted on a young woman who had already been selected and who had been preparing for this marriage since she was a child. The resulting political crisis was severe enough that Nagako's father, Prince Kuniyoshi Kuni, threatened to commit ritual suicide if the engagement was broken, a declaration that escalated the situation beyond what the opposing faction could manage. The matchmakers, who had raised the genetic objection, were forced to resign, and the marriage proceeded. Once married, Nagako faced pressure of a different kind. She bore 4 daughters in succession, and the imperial court's anxiety about a male heir became a sustained atmosphere of institutional expectation that contemporaries described as suffocating. Advisors reportedly raised the possibility of Hirohito taking concubines from the traditional imperial concubine system that still technically existed, a suggestion he refused, a decision that was treated at the time as evidence of remarkable personal virtue rather than what it would be considered in any other context, the bare minimum of basic decency. Crown Prince Akihito was finally born on the 23rd of December, 1933, nearly a decade into the marriage. Hirohito's reign encompassed Japan's transformation from divine empire to defeated nation to constitutional monarchy, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals, American occupation, and eventually a position as a respected constitutional figurehead. He and Nagako remained married until her death in June 2000, at the age of 97. What makes the marriage disturbing is not what happened between them, but the system that surrounded it, one in which a woman's chromosomes were debated by government officials. Her reproductive output was a matter of state emergency managed by committee, and the entire framework of her existence within the marriage was determined by her biological utility to an institution that considered itself divine. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.